It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I'm Dean Julie Mostov. I'm the Dean of Liberal Studies, and yay! So fantastic to see so many of you here tonight for our annual Global Lecture Series. It is truly an amazing event, and it is a thrill to see so many people interested in the topic at hand. We each year invite speakers who embody our liberal studies values and mission of global, interdisciplinary, and engaged scholarship and learning. And certainly, our speaker tonight, Claudia Serrato, is someone who definitely exemplifies those values of global, interdisciplinary, and engaged scholarship and learning. So we are thrilled to have her here tonight with us. First, I don't want to take up too much time because we have a wonderful program, but I do want to thank everyone who has had an important part in making this program possible, those behind the scenes and those here with us on stage. I just want to thank the Dean's Office for doing a fabulous job in putting together such a program, and of course our amazing Professor Cammie Kim Lin. More on her later. And then there are our partners, the Women's Leadership Forum, the Environmental and Racial Justice Network, and the Office of Global Inclusion, NYU Women Lead program. So thanks to all of you, our partners and our staff, and everyone for making this possible, and of course, our speakers. And here to say a little bit more and to welcome you and our speakers is our own, I think we can say that, Winelia Gutierrez, the Associate Vice President of Strategy and Operations within the Office of Global Inclusion. The reason I say our is because Winelia began her career at NYU supporting students and faculty in liberal studies. Since then, she has held key leadership roles in the university relations and public affairs, and now the Office of Global Inclusion. Holding strong with a focus on building impactful, inclusive initiatives that support NYU's global mission. So, I now introduce Winelia and ask her to come up to continue our program. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Good afternoon, or maybe good evening. You can't tell because we're in the dark here. Thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. As Dean Mostov noted, I'm Winelia Gutierrez. My pronouns are she, hers, and you already know my title, so I'm not going to repeat it. It's an honor to be back home. I entered NYU in 1995 as a freshman in the then General Studies program, now known as Liberal Studies. My first job as a work study at NYU was in Liberal Studies, and Liberal Studies continued to be my professional home post-graduation for 15 years. So, LS holds a very special place in my heart. As a first-generation college student and first-generation professional, my time in liberal studies was transformative. Thank you very much to the Ellis community. OGI is excited to be here tonight as part of our ongoing partnership with Liberal Studies through the Global Lecture Series and NYU Women Lead Initiative. NYU Women Lead both celebrates and amplifies the ongoing and impactful work of global women trailblazers, past and present, while centering intersectional gender equity and innovative leadership. It is now my pleasure to introduce a liberal studies trailblazer, our interlocutor for tonight's panel, Dr. Cammie Kim Lin.
Thank you.
Professor Lin is a clinical associate professor of Writer Faculty Award. She teaches first-year writing, food studies, and critical service learning. She has published widely in scholarly journals and edited volumes on topics such as public education, critical pedagogy, queer literacy pedagogy, and English education. She is also a food writer whose work has been published in The Washington Post, Eater.com, and elsewhere. The cookbook she wrote with her sister, Serious New Cook, Recipes, Tips, and Techniques, won a Best Cookbook Award from the International Association of Culinary Professionals.
Thank you so much, Dean Mostoff and Wilnelia. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and have this conversation. Maybe you noticed the two of us have been chatting away already, so we're thrilled to bring you into this conversation tonight. Dr. Claudia Serrato, whose cultural roots are Purépecha and Zacateca, is a distinguished culinary anthropologist, chef, and educator whose expertise in indigenous foods and traditions. She is renowned for her advocacy of food sovereignty and contributions to preserving indigenous foodways. And Dr. Serrato integrates scholarly research with practical culinary work to activate ancestral taste memory. She holds a stream of degrees, starting with a bachelor's in gender, ethnicity, and multicultural studies, a master's in Chicano and Chicana studies, a second master's in anthropology, and a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Washington. She has been featured in countless media outlets, including television, radio, podcast, and print. And she co-founded Across Our Kitchen Tables, an organization supporting women of color in food projects. And she teaches at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Dr. Serrato's approach blends academic insight with hands-on practice, fostering a deep appreciation for the cultural significance of indigenous foods. Based in Los Angeles, she elevates indigenous culinary arts through workshops, cooking classes, and speaking engagements, making her a leading voice in Native food justice. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So welcome to New York City. I know you've spent a lot of time here, but you're based in California. At events like this, or just events in general at NYU, we usually start by acknowledging the island on which we're gathering, which is known to the Lenape people as Mannahatta, and the specific land on which we're sitting now, which is known as Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. Indeed, the land on which our campus actually was built once served as an important gathering place and a cultural hub for the Lenape, with a nearby settlement called Sapokanikan. We also acknowledge that the history of settler colonialism, beginning over 400 years ago, violently displaced the Lenape. So our hope is not merely to make this acknowledgement, but actually to engage in this conversation that moves beyond an acknowledgement and truly honors these first people, past, present, and future. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel that it's really important for us to definitely go beyond just the land acknowledgement, right? It's about relationality. It's about reciprocity. It's about learning the history of the land, of the people, of the plants. I've come to learn, right? This comes a lot from indigenous cultural stewards, food stewards, seed stewards from Mexico, actually, the Zapatistas. They teach a lot about, Caracol's theory is what they call it, which is the snail and how it moves. And what I've learned is that for us to really think about futurities, it's really important for us to make sure we understand the past so that we can make sense of the present and what that means in terms of Indigenous relations and accountability. I feel like that's something we need to work on more. And I say we and by that I mean the institution, I mean government, community, right? And so I really appreciate you sharing that, and I'm really looking forward to engaging more with, what does that look like for New York? What does that look like for NYU in building and strengthening Indigenous relations?
Thank you so much. That actually sets up a perfect framework for our conversation tonight. The idea that decolonial theory, a method of it, is to look at the past in order to understand the present, right? Understanding how our colonial past informs our present, and then critiquing the present in order to look to the future and try to imagine a more liberated, decolonized future. So using that framework of looking at the past and then the present and then the future, I have a couple of questions just to sort of help set the stage, I guess, before we dive into your past a little bit and what brought you here. First, just so that we're all on the same page, I wonder if you would talk just for a couple minutes about some of the terminology that we're already using. A lot of people here, probably everyone here, has heard these terms: Indigenous food sovereignty, Indigenous food justice. Could you talk a little bit about what that means to you?
Sure. So the word sovereignty, it's very complex because we can talk about sovereignty as in terms of like settler state, in terms of government. It's also affiliated with like tribal politics. And then there's sovereignty as in the right to be self-determined, the right to choose what we eat, the right to produce the foods that are culturally relevant. And in thinking about this in terms of food justice, it not only is it affiliated with like community and culture, but it's also the food itself, right? The food needs justice. Many foods today are tainted, they're highly processed, they are too displaced. I think a lot about like environmental racism, and it's not just something that happens to people. It's not just a human experience. It's also a plant experience. It's also a non-human experience. And so in the communities that I surround myself with and where I receive my teachings, both in the institution and out of the institution, when we talk about Indigenous food sovereignty, we're also talking about the cosmology. We're talking about the stories. We're talking about the recipes. We're talking about the ingredients. We're talking about the seasons. And we're also doing our best to take care of the land, right? Because without land, you can't have food. And so those two go hand in hand, food justice and Indigenous, food sovereignty. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more in terms of thinking about, well, we also cannot have food justice without like reproductive justice. We also cannot have, right? Like these are all intersectional. So I feel like it's an entry point, but it's not an end point.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thinking about those ideas and the need for Indigenous food justice is part of this framing from the past. Could you talk to us a little bit about the colonial impacts on Indigenous food systems and why sovereignty, both food and land sovereignty, is so important to Indigenous communities?
Yes. So I think I'm going to make this a little personal. So part of my own journey in really understanding Indigenous food knowledge and Indigenous food systems was me really trying to make sense of what is my cultural heritage food. And, why is it that I'm being told over and over, and this was like, oh my goodness, maybe about 28 years ago, long time ago, where I was told that my cultural heritage foods were basically going to set me up to be diabetic. We're going to set me up to be obese. We're going to set me up to have cancer. And that to me was a problem. I was like, because I'm a woman of color, like that's my destiny. And, at the time, my grandfather had a heart attack, and I was trying to just make sense. And it really came from my grandfather, having a conversation with him and asking him, and I'm getting a little emo right now, too, by the way. I asked him, abuelito, what were the foods that you ate growing up? Because I'm trying to make sense of what I'm being told. And what he shared with me was really a diet that was basada de planta, which is plant-based. And I thought, okay, well then what changed, right? And he talked about it. And of course, he didn't use the words assimilation and acculturation because he didn't have that, that language. But that's what he was explaining to me in terms of his, migrant story, his experience, right, and being an immigrant in the United States. And so I was like, okay, that's an opportunity for me to go deeper. And I did. And so I began my early research, really wanting to understand the colonial encounters, particularly the Spanish colonial encounter in Mexico. And, it was really interesting because I talked to a professor in Chicano studies about this. And he was like, Claudia, it's one thing for you to study and learn this, but I think it's really important for you to also understand the Spanish colonial diet and the logic behind their diet. So you can make sense of how culinary mestizaje occurred in Mexico, which is like the merging of Spanish colonial foodways and indigenous foods, right, of Mexico. And so first I was real hesitant. I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm tired of studying the colonizer ways. And I was really resistant. I was like, no. I'm going to focus on Mexico. I'm going to focus on Mesoamerica. And I did. And, I came to learn that for the indigenous peoples of Mexico and the Southwest and, even here, the Lenape, because there was indigenous trade routes, right? We see evidence of purépechas in Louisiana. How did that happen, right? How is there wild amaranths growing in Minnesota? That the foodways were not just local, they weren't just organic, they weren't just seasonal, and what's the other word? It's local, ecological, seasonal, sustainable, organic, and native, right? But they were plant-based, more so corn-based. And, and that's how we thrived, right? 80% of our diet was corn-based. And that just doesn't mean we were just consuming corn as, raw corn, the way we know it as sweet corn on the cob. There was a variety of ways to consume it, right? Whether it was tortillas or tamales or pupusas or atole like we had earlier today. And, in my journey of unearthing and making sense of my cultural heritage foods, I still had that question. Well, take the tamal, for example. Well, how is it that the tamal changed? Because in looking at the anthropological archive and the archaeological archive, the tamal were made of larvae, they were made of avocado, they were made of cacao, they were made of all kinds of other flavors that have never been offered to me. And, like in East LA, because that's where I'm from, right? The options are chicken, beef, pork, or rajas con queso. And I was like, well, where did that come from? How did that, become part of the indigenous diet? And so I did do what the professor asked me to do. And I began to study the Spanish colonial mindset and the body logic. And the idea was, unfortunately, that food, plant food, was considered feminine food. It was also considered food that was water-based. And, the Spanish colonizer did not want to eat food that was feminized or feminine food, because then that would take away their superiority. So this is like early white supremacy type of logic that was happening. They also did not want to consume the corn because they believed it was for inferior people. And it was more so food to feed the animals. And so that's how they went about in introducing like wheat and other foods that were made more sense to them. And because they pushed on that idea throughout Mexico, then many indigenous communities there were like, wow, maybe if we eat like our oppressor, maybe then we will be, part of this, we'll be more accepted. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But what we saw then, or what we have seen, is this this not just was it a cultural mixing and a racial mixing, but we also see it as a culinary mixing, where now we have wheat flour, now we have chicken, beef, and pork, right? And these were all new ingredients that became part of the Mesoamerican diet.
So I'm imagining you as a young student learning about this, studying this. I know that you have spoken about, have told this really interesting story that I'm hoping you'll share also about reading Sherry Moraga's work and learning about this idea of the colonized body and that being a real aha moment for you and leading you into this work. I wonder if you could share that story.
I would
and talk
love
a little bit
to
about
share that story. So like I shared, I'm on this path, I'm on this pathway. I'm telling my family I'm going to be vegan because that was the only the language that I had. And they're looking at me like, you tripping? Like, girl, how are you going to be that? Like, you're Mexicana. Like, you can't be that. Like, you're going to eat rabbit food. You need salad. And I'm like, no, I'm going back to my cultural heritage foods. And, the original way is plant way. And, and it was something we all experienced together. So while I'm doing this, I'm also pursuing higher ed. I'm also educating myself. I'm becoming knowledgeable on body politics. I'm really, studying, Chicana Indígena theory. And, I'm a big on Zalduin, right? So I'm like really into we were talking about the wild tongue. And so I'm taking this Chicana, it was a Chicana psychology class. And I was asked to read an essay by Sherry Moraga, which is Queer Aslan. And mind you, at this time, we're doing decolonial studies. We're reading Chela Sandoval. We're reading about differential consciousness and, how to decolonize our mind. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm doing the work, right? We're changing the narrative. And then I read her piece, and she talks about Aslan. And in her essay, she says, Aslan is no longer a mythological homeland, but is indeed flesh, skin, and bones, which is under white imperialist, patriarchal United States. It's under occupation. And I thought, well, hold on a second. If Aslan is no longer a mythological homeland, but is indeed flesh, skin, and bones, which is what was in the essay, we're talking about my body. And if my body is still under occupation, and early colonialism happened over 500 years ago, how am I still being colonized? And so I just sat there and I was like thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking. And then all of a sudden my abuelito came into mind. And I was like, oh, my mouth, my tongue. That's the colonial, the last colonial frontier. And it was in that moment that I realized that decolonizing my body was about decolonizing my taste buds. It was about reprogramming, reteaching my body to crave the foods of my ancestors.
Thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about other women who have played a pivotal role for you in this journey? Other women who really have demonstrated leadership and inspired and influenced you in this work?
Yeah. So I think it's important for me to talk a little bit about my upbringing, because this is not something that was just new to me. Growing up, again, I had a lot of elders. I was blessed to have my abuelas. I was blessed to have my mom. And when you think about your abuelas, and they're in spirit world now, that's a whole other experience. They kept me fed, and they kept me fed with beans. They kept me fed with nopales, which is cactus. As a young girl, I would love to help my mom in the kitchen, and we have my grandmother's, her mother's molcajete, and she would say, Claudita, make the salsa, and it was just okay, this is what you do. You get the volcanic rock and you start grinding, and they really taught me the appreciation of food, the appreciation of flavor. So I was really curious as to, what ingredients are being put in there. My sister would always say to me, like, start eating your food. And I was like, no, it's not. I'm looking for a taste. Like there's a something I'm looking for. She's like, what do you, add salt, add chile. And I would stir my food until it was perfect. So these were some of the early influences. But I want to say, like, as I've continued to cook professionally, right? So in 2012, I became part of a group, collective, the Native American Culinary Association. And there we brought in all kinds of Native chefs from all over Turtle Island. And it's where I met these just fierce and amazing Indigenous women chefs. And, they were just there to reaffirm everything I was cooking. They weren't like, oh, girl, I don't know. They were like, yes, let's try this and let's explore this and let's do this cut. And some of these people, one of them is a kitchen curandera. Her name is Felicia Cocotzin Riz. She's out in Arizona. She's Tewa. And then there's Chef Loretta Oden. She is actually one of the first Indigenous culinary anthropologists I met. And, she was just, she lives in New Mexico, Albuquerque. And she's an elder, right? So again, elder knowledge, elder energy. I felt that was great because she was also a professional in the field. And another person is Andrea Murdoch, Chef Andrea Murdoch. She is from Venezuela. And she really helped me rethink like my ingredients and my techniques because they all went to culinary school. They were classically trained where I was traditionally trained, right? So I learned by being in the kitchen with my family. And of course, there's also like my ancestors I think about Malintzin Tenepal, which is one of the, we call her like the mother of the Mestizo Nation. Then there's also the earth goddess Cotlique, right? Tonantzin. These are other diosas, other goddesses that have survived, and their teachings have survived, and they reinforce the need to remember who we are through our food traditions.
Thank you so much. We've talked a bunch together today about how, as you can all tell, Dr. Serrato is involved in so many different things, all overlapping, but certainly not just an academic and not just a public scholar, but all of those things at once. And it seems to me there may be something about women in particular who become scholars, and whether it's culinary anthropologists or in whatever field, but who manage to activate this knowledge, not just in academia, in the classroom, but in all aspects of our lives. And it just sounds like that's something you have done for such a long time, right?
Yeah, I was, nowadays we call it receipts, right? You gather your receipts, and I'm like, well, I've been doing this for, even before I knew I was going to be doing this, even before I knew I was going to pursue higher ed, I was cooking. I was making tamales. I was, really moving food and making it a center to my life. Even in my daughter's pregnancy, I made sure that, I was thinking a lot about what I was consuming. Did you want me to talk about that?
Could you talk a little bit about this idea of indigenous womb ecology?
Yes. So, so like I shared with you all, food justice is really intersected also with like reproductive justice. And I was on that trajectory. I was like, I'm going to become a culinary doula. I want to prepare, prenatal foods and postnatal foods for reproductive bodies. And I want to cook for them. And I want to make them native food. And sure enough, I turned out, I was pregnant, and I was really curious about my amniotic fluid. I was like, if this child during intrauterine life is floating in there, like at some point they must be swallowing this fluid. And so I decided to go into the science, and I learned that in fact, during intrauterine life, babies are drinking the amniotic fluid, and about 4 months they start developing their taste buds. And Michelle Odent has done research called womb ecology, which has determined that what we consume or what we expose to from the time of conception up to the age of 2, sometimes even up to the age of 5, will determine our health outcome as an adult. And so for me, I was like, okay, hold on. Now let me re-indigenize this. Let me think about this from an indigenous perspective. And so immediately I turned to my ancestral ingredients. I decided to indigenize my whole entire prenatal nutrition by consuming like chia seed, wild rice, pecan pudding, and so forth. But it wasn't necessarily because I wanted to indigenize my nutrition, but it was because I wanted to flavor my amniotic fluid, because the amniotic fluid takes on the flavor of what you put into your body. And so for me, I was really determined to birth a baby with decolonized taste buds. That was like my purpose. And kid you not, I also consumed like chile. And I was told by my family, don't eat chile, it's going to give you heartburn. I'm like, but I need her to like habanero, you know? And to this day, and this is why it's magic, because my daughter loves to eat chile. So I'm like, oh my goodness, it worked.
That's great.
It worked.
Okay, so speaking of those decolonized taste buds and these ingredients in particular you just mentioned, would you talk with us just for a moment about some of the things that our guests here have been able to taste, which come from 2 of your recipes?
Yes. So one of them is the atole. This one here, it's a corn-based atole with a pecan milk. And, for me, atole is it's beyond decolonial, and it's like strengthening and we talk about re-indigenization, but I feel like it's strengthening indigenous relations. Atole is a signifier of resilience. It has been here since the beginning of time, at least in for my cultural background. It's a marker of, again, how we resist colonization. It's also a healer. It has the potential to heal. And it also has the ability to enact our ancestral memories and our abuela memories. And so for me, it was really important to introduce the atole with the pecan milk, as a way to celebrate, a little bit of me. So you get to have a little taste of me. And then it's also to the season. This is a time that our families consume a lot of atole. And for the first time, I've heard many students say, this is the first time I ever tried atole. We had a demo earlier. And it was so beautiful because folks were like making cultural connections. And they're like, I'm not even, from Mexico, but this reminds me of home. And I had another student who said he immediately called his grandmother, because it just reminded him of his abuela. The other recipe you have, it's the wild rice chia pudding. And again, for me, when I first came out to the East Coast working at an Indigenous Food Sovereignty Summit, I was asked to work with wild rice. And during this time, I was really big on like raw indigenous food. And I was like, oh, what if I prepare, a wild rice and I turned it into pudding? And the communities that I was working with, they couldn't believe it. They're like, we've never had wild rice pudding before. And I was like, ooh. And I wanted to honor the indigenous trade route. So I went ahead and added chia to it. And so I thought it would just be so nice to bring that back and offer it to you all so you can have a taste of the landscape here, a taste of memory, and also to, just be able to have a different kind of appreciation for wild rice, because we don't just have to consume it as the whole grain. We can also make other foods with it. And I think that's what's really beautiful about indigenous ingredients and indigenous foodways is that there's room for innovation, there's room for creativity, and there's a new way to tell our stories through the menus and through the recipes that we create.
Thank you so much. They were delicious, weren't they? And thank you so much to the kitchen who prepared all of these. They were beautiful too. So you have spoken about the concept of recipes, not as archives, but as codices. Yes. And I wonder if you can explain this concept, including your use of the term and its significance in preserving Indigenous knowledge.
Yes. So when I was working on my dissertation, my advisor was asking me about my recipes, and I kept referring to them as a codice. I was like, oh, like, the codice. And she was like, but, if they get shelved and it gets put on, the shelf and, it's does it speak to the feminist archive, trying to really get me to think with like feminist theory. And I was like, I'm sorry, but I cannot relate to the archive. I was like, because it's a codice. A codice is a living document, a living theory, a living methodology. It's to be passed down, not put up on a shelf. And so when I began to design my menus, the intention was that my menus, if you ask me or if you look deep, they actually embody and hold traditional ecological knowledge. They are... they materialize. We get to consume it. We get to embody it because we're eating the food of the narrative of the story. And so I refer to menus and recipes as a codice or a codex because it's a cultural passing down of knowledge. It's to preserve our like cultural understanding, but it's not to be shelved. It's not to be put up in a museum. It's to be, shared and look. The we say at home is convivir, right? We are to live with it. It's a living spirit.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the idea, really, that these recipes are living also. In the ways that they can grow, right? They can shift and change. It's not just an artifact of a recipe from the past, but there are all these ways they can shift and change. So for many people, the terms organic, local, seasonal, sustainable conjure up images of like a chic California farm-to-table restaurant. In fact, I think many people believe that the farm-to-table movement, this movement that started in the 70s really was birthed in California, right, in these restaurants. But there's something a little bit misguided about that, I think. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
I mean, this was birthed in the pueblos. This was birthed, in tribal homelands. The colonizer came and disrupted what was organic, native, local, ecological, sustainable. And, especially for folks that understand food politics, there's also a narrative to that, right? When food became organic and who was able to name and say what is organic and what is not, right? Like this is all part of a food politic. But I have to agree with you. This has been here since time immemorial. I mean, I've talked to farm workers in California, and I've tried talking to them about decolonizing, and I got schooled so quick. And they're like, in Spanish, they're like, ¿Qué descolonizando? ¿Qué nada? And they're like, it's a milpa diet, which is a farm worker diet, a campesino diet, and and these ways are natural ways. And they might not have like the organic USDA certification, but their food is very organic, right? And so what I have discovered or what I have witnessed is that by calling certain foods or making it like a food movement, like something new, what it's really doing is creating and perpetuating indigenous erasure, erasure of knowledge, erasure of culture, erasure of landscape. And then, we have also other issues, right, that are connected to the environment, like private property. Growing up, my dad used to take me foraging out to Malibu, and we used to forage abalone. And I asked him one time, hey, Dad, like, how can we stop doing that? And he's like, oh, they gave me a ticket. And I was like, wow, he was trying to enact his food sovereignty and bring home some abalone. And guess what? That ended. And so, again, right, like that was organic, natural, but now it's like now there is somebody that has to put a stamp on it. And again, it that really speaks to power and control, right? And so there's a lot of problems. It's very problematic.
Could you talk a little bit more about the ways that Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous food justice can support even modern sustainability efforts, right? There's so much emphasis on sustainability right now. What are some ways that those two things, the movements, I guess, can support one another?
I think really from listening to the elders and listening to the folks that are on the ground, like doing this work day in and day out, really, it's about giving cultural stewardship over the original, like to the people of the original landscapes. They have the cultural understanding. They have the original instructions of how to go about and creating restorative and regenerative food systems that ultimately allow for sustainability to thrive. And what I've come to know, what I've come to recognize is that we're going to get this when we return to our cultural heritage foods. And also to foods of the region, right? Like the Lenape. What are the Lenape foodways? And I think that's also something that we need to consider more and more if we really want to achieve sustainability, because it's one thing to say, okay, well, we want to grow citrus trees here. Citrus trees they're not from here. They don't thrive in this landscape, but you're going to create artificial environments to make that happen in the name of sustainability. And so I always question, again, whose definition of sustainability and who's being sustained and who's not, right? And I think this is what academia teaches us, to be very, very critical, about food, about anything, is really asking, okay, well, who are the ones that made these instructions? But ultimately, when we're talking about food justice and when we're talking about Indigenous food sovereignty, it goes back to having access to land, but it also goes back to remembering our foods, our ingredients, our menus, our recipes, which is why I advocate strongly for bringing in more Indigenous chefs, having more Indigenous chef demos. I've seen it all over Turtle Island, where folks are like returning to cultural heritage foods. They're having, food sovereignty efforts, gardens, community gardens. And at the end, folks are like, well, how do I cook this? What do I make with this? And so, I mean, are we really, if we are applying, agroecology, but if we don't know how to prepare the food that we are, growing to be sustainable, then are we really being sustainable?
Thank you. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the local and maybe even hyper-local. Could you talk about that, like the local implications of Indigenous food sovereignty, particularly in urban settings like New York City, which is, by some measures, said to have among the largest, if not the we had this big conversation about this earlier. Yeah. Does LA have a larger urban Indigenous population, or New York City? How it's captured, how those numbers are captured is complicated, but we can at least safely say both New York City and Los Angeles have really large populations of urban Indigenous folks. So knowing that that's true, I guess, what are the implications of that, right?
Yeah.
This urban population here and this work being done in places like this. Very different, right? Different climates, different cultures.
Absolutely. The one thing about returning to, really pushing food justice and really aligning with food sovereignty efforts on a local level, yes, not only is it going to feed the people, yes, not only is, are we going to work on restoring Indigenous health and Indigenous health systems and relationships, but we're also really like speaking to like the biodiversity of the landscape. I feel like that's something we kind of push to the side when it comes to the environment. It's always like people first, environment second. And, what I have seen, especially like in my own home, I had a beautiful lawn, typical urban home. And one day I was like, you know what? I might not be able to give my little piece of land back to the cultural stewards of my area, but I'm going to give it back to the plants. And in doing so, I took out all my lawn and I planted native plants. And in doing so, I have seen so much life. I mean, from the birds to the bees to the insects to, right? And so it's kind of rethinking again, biodiversity. It's thinking about how we can live, right, ecologically. So it's really regenerating ecological systems, relationships, right, that can occur. And then now I have the opportunity to teach people how to use these foods and how to integrate these foods into their diet. And when we do that, then we're really addressing, issues around cancer, diabetes, obesity, and discovering really, or relearning or re-indigenizing, right, our foodways, knowing that I can make elderberry, reduction and put it on top of my chia pudding. And not only is it going to, connect me to the landscape because I'm from there, but it's also going to, do the medicinal work it's meant to do, right? This is why we say food is our medicine, because it really is, and Robin Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about how when we begin to consume the food of the land, it also connects us to the land. It also allows us to become native to place. And I think that's something that we need to think more about. We might not be native to that area that we're residing in, but there's a way to honor, and there's a way to be in relation, and there's a way to put indigenous logics and indigenous teachings and indigenous foods first.
Thank you. So this all makes sense in this local context, but I wonder also then, on the other end of the spectrum, about global connections among Indigenous communities, or this work across this land, Turtle Island, and across the globe, actually.
Yeah. We're seeing this huge, global Indigenous rising. I've been following other Indigenous food movements, like out by the Kanaka Maui, and there's been so much push to bring back the native foods from that area. And again, the results are the same. We are restoring biodiversity. Folks' health is improving. And this is also thinking about mental health and physical health, right? It's happening. The teachings, the songs, the ceremonies, all of that is what's coming back. And now there's, we have social media. So now we're in contact with one another. Now, it's like a follow for follow. Somebody follows you from Australia, and they're doing, revitalizing the bush food out there, right? And you're like, whoa, I'm connecting with, the Maori, and I'm connecting with, other folks in, Indonesia and India. And we see this happening all around. And the one thing that always comes back in thinking about just the global indigenous is that people are realizing, what? Our foodways have been colonized too. And we have the very similar narrative. But when we begin to re-indigenize, and by that I mean culturally center our food, we are beginning to see better health outcomes. We are also beginning to see, better relationships. We are actually a lot more closer than we think we are, even though we're so far away, right? And so I've definitely been seeing this huge convergence. I know with the Smithsonian, for example, we were out in DC this summer, and we were doing a whole piece on indigenous foods and world foods. And in 2025, it's going to be hosted in Japan. And so we're going to be out in Japan working with the indigenous communities there, because they want to know how the indigenous communities here are eating, and we want to know how the indigenous communities there are eating, right? And what are those regenerative systems that are working? And so we are not asking permission. We are just doing the work ourselves. We're tired of waiting. We're tired for somebody to tell us, this is how you have to eat. This is how your portions need to look. And it's well, that doesn't apply to us, because those are not the foods of our ancestors, and so.
You've used a term a couple of times that I wonder if you'll talk a little bit about, and that's re-indigenizing.
Yes.
Would you speak to the difference for you between decolonizing and re-indigenizing?
Yes. So, okay. So there's different positions one can take when it comes to decolonizing. And I'm going to put this in the context of food, because you can decolonize your diet, but that can mean something very different for an individual. Decolonizing the diet could mean getting away from the standard American diet. It could be like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to eat that way. I'm going to, think about what's local and seasonal in the area that I live. That's one way to go about it. Then you could do the radical way, which was how I came into this. And I was like, I'm taking out all the colonizer food. I'm not eating chicken, beef, or pork ever, getting away from dairy. And you could do it that way.
Is that the 25-year-old Claudia?
That's 25-year-old Claudia. And then there's folks that are saying, okay, wow, you can continue to work on decolonizing Western food systems, or you could put your energy in doing your best to revitalize indigenous ones, right? And so that means we're no longer trying to decolonize the West or Western influences of food, because it's time consuming. There are still indigenous ones, and we need to feed those. I also understand, because of the work that I've done in so many, food sovereign spaces, is that a lot of indigenous foods continue to be colonized. And so I'm like, well, they still need, there's still work to decolonize that food. But I was talking to an incredible woman. Her name is Aday. She's from First Nations Development Institute. And she said, yes, but even within those indigenous, foods, there's still indigenous epistemologies. There's still indigenous ways of going about and gathering the food, eating the food, preparing the food that I only want to focus on. And so she said, you can continue doing the decolonial work. She thought, I'm going to focus on re-indigenizing or indigenizing, the food of my people. And so I've come to, I all are important. Not one is more than another. This is not, a power Olympic game. What it is that they all need to happen at the same time, and they are. And so sometimes, I look at work and I'm thinking, okay, beyond decolonization. So then I focus on, indigenous food systems, indigenous knowledge, indigenous culinary art. But then there's times where I get asked as a professional, hey, I want to work on indigenizing this menu. So then in order for me to indigenize the menu, I need to decolonize it first. And so, it gets complex, but I think once you continue to do this work over and over and over again, it gets more simple.
Thank you so much. So we talked about the past, we talked about the work in the present, thinking now a little bit more toward the future. I want to return to this idea of the land acknowledgements and the things we often say. So in our formal land acknowledgements, we often note things like, as those who work, teach, and learn here, we bear the responsibility to acknowledge and work meaningfully to address the erasure of this history, to recognize, affirm, and support Indigenous sovereignty, and to address the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here at NYU in New York City. What do you think educational institutions like NYU can do to support, in particular, Indigenous food justice and sovereignty?
Yeah. All institutions, I feel, need to really work on building relationships with the indigenous communities. I know in New York, here in Manhattan, there's a Lenape Cultural Center. And so as an institution like NYU, I feel that there should be more opportunity for students to learn with the indigenous stewards, the original peoples. And so that can look like or mean inviting them onto the campus, doing chef demos, teaching an indigenous food studies program or a class, and bringing in the stewards, the knowledge keepers. I feel like there should also be perhaps scholarships for students that want to teach and more so do research and learn about indigenous foods, that there should be that type of programming, cultural programming that truly centers the opportunity to be accountable to the place and to no longer perpetuate cultural and indigenous erasure, and also to encouraging students, right, to go into the communities and to not come in as experts, right, like this white hero complex. Like, we need to get away from that. I feel like it's like, I'm here to learn. what do you have to teach me? Being true active listeners, not, I come with the answers. I have a PhD. I feel like we need to sort of get away from that and really understand what it means to be in community and show up, right? Attend community events. I know that there's many happening, and, it is important for NYU to say, you know what, we're here. How can we sponsor? How can we, provide resources for you? And I mean, there's a lot more, just, whew.
Thank you so much. I'm really heartened by the incredible showing of folks tonight at this event, students, faculty, people in the community alike. It's very obvious that people are hungry for this conversation and hungry to learn about this. So I have plenty more questions, and I'm really anxious to just continue this conversation together. But let's pause that for a moment so we can open it up to questions from you all, from folks here in the room. And also we have a lot of people on Zoom who may have questions. And then maybe at the end, I might come back and ask you a couple more quick questions.
And I like to open it up to more than just questions. Sometimes we have comments, sometimes we have reflections. And I feel like that's also important to share.
Thank you. Absolutely. Okay, so for folks who are in the room with us who have comments or reflections or questions you'd like to share, we're going to ask that you use a mic. We've got some folks in the room who will sort of manage that because we want to make sure that the sound is captured for the people who are on Zoom. So if you have a question, you want to raise your hand, somebody with a mic will come to you or comment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just had a little question. In a world that's becoming more globalized and, with social media becoming increasingly more popular, like TikTok, Instagram Reels and whatnot, how do you think it's going to change for people reconnecting with their cultural foods when it can become so easy for just any meal to kind of blow up on TikTok, and you have, people all over the world trying out different foods, like even in this city, like I've noticed like Korean food has become a lot more popular, and there's become like whole meals have become trends at certain points.
There's the threat of co-optation. I've seen that happen. I've seen chefs that are not from Oaxaca write Oaxacan cookbooks. And so I feel like it's been happening. But I also see the good in it because we do have social media and when people are hashtagging, we are taking it out of the shadows, right? Like it's something to not be embarrassed about. I know for me, again, like I would prepare my cultural heritage food when I went to Catholic school growing up. And I got made ashamed of, like I was teased. So I would hide it. And I started to eat cafeteria food. And now I see like the young generations showing cultural pride where it's like, you know what, you have to eat this and you want to eat this. But I think like we need to still be, critical. I've seen Rachel Ray, for example, she made a pozole. And I think she added like sour cream, and it's like, no one adds sour cream to their pozole, So, I mean, and I think that's why there's room for comments, right? Unless somebody turns off their comments, then that's when you want to become skeptical. Like, why are you turning off your comments? You want to be able to receive and get that kind of feedback. And I feel like more and more people are a lot more brave these days. Like folks are calling out people like, like I wouldn't necessarily make it that way, or we're affirming folks like, you know what? Thank you. That reminds me of my abuela, or thank you. And so I feel like we should all be responsible, right? Like post responsibly. And I think maybe that's something we need to teach, even in academia. I think we can't erase and pretend like it's something that happens outside. I feel like social media is here to stay. And so like, how do we teach to post responsibly? And more so like understanding that just like, the colonizer did, 500 years back in Mesoamerica and here 400 years ago, right? Like there's an opportunity to make something like your own. For example, even the concept of like superfoods, it's chia, it's amaranth, and it's spirulina. And I'm like, my ancestors ate that every day. And now, right, there's communities that don't even have access to it, like quinoa. like, the Quechua in South America because it's so expensive. So I feel like we need to comment, and we also need to just, maybe create, instructions or some agreements in terms of like ethical posting when it comes to food. But I'm all about posting. I think it's so great when we can, because we share recipes and then, people reshare. So make sure your content is shareable, right? But good question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that really enlightening talk. I especially loved what you shared about recipes as codices and also decolonizing versus re-indigenizing. I'm actually taking an interdisciplinary seminar this semester. It's called Black and Indigenous Foodways Across and Beyond the Americas. It's such a wonderful class. I think I saw some of my classmates here in the audience, but kind of to that point and thinking about intertwining foodways, I've wondered if you specifically have done any work in connecting foodways with others who may not identify with Indigenous or as Indigenous, but still have their foodways and their food sovereignty affected by colonialism.
Yes. So I live in LA, and so, I also teach. And so I have, whenever I teach food courses or ethnic food courses, or even in the community when I'm doing workshops, I do have community members that do come from, different ethnic backgrounds, but predominantly in Los Angeles, we have, Black and brown families. And again, I feel that there's so much anti-indigeneity and there's so much anti-Blackness that even within the respective cultures, there's a little heat between the groups. And so I always do my best whenever I do teach about ethnic food studies, especially pertaining to my own culture, is that a lot of like the cultural influences and a lot of foods that I eat, do come and are African influenced. And so I make sure to teach about, the African diaspora in foods and how it's impacted Latino cultural heritage foods, and the indigenous foods of the Americas per se, because a lot of the foods that we consume are also, foods that are African influenced. And so once we get to that place and we understand, food within that respective context, then I have students that are like, well, you know what, I want to explore this further. And so I do encourage, African indigeneity. Some folks refer to it as a Ma'at diet, which is returning to an earth-based diet. And I'm like, yes, let's do it. I also have colleagues that they themselves have gone to Africa to learn, in making those connections. So now there are dinner pop-ups that are happening that are honoring indigenous, Black indigeneity. And, but it's a lot of work. It's not easy because you still got to talk about race and gender and class and colonialism. And, it's just unpeeling until we get to like, okay, so what are our commonalities here, and why is ethnicity important? And, what does this mean, for you and your family? And earlier today at the demo, I had a student, she came up to me and she said, you know what, I've never had atole before in my life. She's like, but my family's from Nigeria. She's like, and this reminds me of home. And I was like, oh, she's like, they're just different ingredients, but I know this. I know atole. And I was like, wow, right? So those opportunities also when we prepare the food and we allow students to taste it, it's when we're like, wait a minute, how do I know this? If I was born and raised in Nigeria and you were born in Mexico, it's like, well, how do you know this, right? And so then we start to investigate, and it becomes a journey, right? That we get to explore together, and then we realize we have more commonality than difference.
Our next question is from the overflow room, actually. Oh. What food do you see has been colonized the most? I've seen corn and how industrialized it's been. Are there other examples?
I guess just in the spirit of corn, I'm going to go back to the tamal. It's probably because it's tamal season, and I love tamales. There's so much lard put into the tamal. Again, there's chicken, beef, and pork. So one of my first blog posts many years back, I used to have this blog called Decolonial, Food for Thought. And I wrote a piece on the tamal. I wrote a piece on what does it mean to decolonize the tamal. And it was, again, rethinking all the ingredients that's being put into the tamal. And, one thing that the archaeological record shows is that tamales were actually made using not just corn flour, but amaranth flour. And so for me, when I make my tamales, I make blue corn tamales, hand ground every year. And I always add amaranth flour to it. And it allows for the tamal to rise. It allows it for it to really be its like true authentic self. And I honor it that way. And I feel like we've lost that connection. I feel like the tamal now is just a tamal. And I'm like, no, like this kept my people alive for, hundreds of years. And I've also, rethought like some of the ingredients like not the pescuite, tequesquite. Tequesquite is a riser. It's a lake mineral. And I've also included that in my tamal. And so, it's a really decolonized version of the tamal, but more so it's an indigenized version of a tamal.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm in a class of Indigenous studies here, and we watched a film called Gather, and it was a lot about like re-educating Indigenous communities that were like detached, with, relying more on commodity foods and things of that nature. I'm from Chile, and I was wondering specifically, you said you're like from East LA, talking about the necessary foundations on like re-indigenizing your food sources when you are like apart from the land that you are native to. Yeah. I was just wondering about like, what are the struggles that come with re-educating people that have indigenous roots yet have become so detached from the culture itself?
Yeah. So first off, I'm glad you watched that documentary. One of my mentors, Chef Nephi Craig, he's the one that brought me into the Native American Culinary Association, was featured there. And it's just a fabulous film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you watch it. But this makes me think about the immigrant experience. One thing, and I'm actually teaching a Latino U.S. identity course right now, and I'm centering it on food. And what I've seen is that for many indigenous community members, right, you leave your home and you migrate, you immigrate, and you don't have the ingredients that you do at home. And what's happening is that because we're so resilient and we are finding other ingredients, right, similar. So we're doing our best to still have and create a taste of home, while using other ingredients. But sometimes those other ingredients are not natural. They're not, daily harvested, right? They are processed foods. And then what we're also seeing, which has become a problem, is that folks now want to assimilate and acculturate a little quicker, right? So they're just trying to skip acculturation and go straight to assimilation because they want to be, quote unquote American, right? They want to fit in. And in doing so, then less foods from home are being prepared. What I've seen with the younger generations is that many will go home to eat their foods, parents' foods, but then when they're like in their dorm or when they're with their friends, they're running off to the fast food places or they're eating these other foods. And I've had a few students say to me, well, it's embarrassing to say like, this is what I want to eat. And I'm like, why is it embarrassing? And they're like, they look at me like, why it's embarrassing, And I'm like, no, like we need to really stand proud of our food. And I have to remind them about the role of women and the role of their grandmother. And that the reason why they have pupusas at home and tortillas hecho de mano at home is because of their grandmother's grandmothers. And this is a testament, right? This is I tell them like, your home is decolonized. Like this is, part of your, indigenous legacy. And so if you struggle with it, but like in terms of the families, they've been able to, still create the foods from home, but a little differently. And which is why, like, for example, in Texas, we have Tex-Mex cuisine, because a lot of those ingredients are not ingredients you're going to find in the pueblos, but you're going to find them at an ethnic food store, or you might find them at, a mainstream market. And you're going to be like, wow, maybe I'll just use this ingredient in place of this other ingredient. So for me, this speaks to why there's a need that's not being met. We need more cultural heritage foods from home. But then we have border patrolling, and like, for example, the cacao beans cannot come unless they're roasted, right? Crickets, they need to be roasted and salted before they cross the border. And so we have, again, policing, right? The policing of our food. But this is why I love, and I totally support 100% street vendors, because they find a way. They find a way, and it's like, and if you're in East LA, like, you want a good taco, you're going to go to the street vendor, right? If you want like a good quesadilla of, huitlacoche, like, you're going to go to a street vendor, which is, the corn fungus. And again, some folks have to, hide it to bring it into the States. And unfortunately for some members and some communities, it gets found and it gets trashed. And it's like, that's like your livelihood, So I think it's a struggle, and I think it's something that, needs to be worked on in terms of like food politics and food policies. And I think we're getting there, because like in LA, for example, I'm, LA County, the LA County just allowed home cooks to get permitted to run their homes as a home-based restaurant. And so I just completed one of the programs, right? So I'm going to have a soft opening probably in April of next year to run home indigenous plant-based restaurant out of my home. And so I think like things are happening. It's slow because we're in 2024. You would think by now legislation would change a little bit, which is why for folks that are in policy and doing food policy work, like, I encourage you to continue to advocate, right, for your abuela's foods, for your grandmother's foods, right, to be able to come here, because it also asserts who we are. It's part of our ethnic identity or our cultural identity. I wouldn't know who I am if it wasn't for like the atole or, the pozole or the tamales that I eat at home or that I grew up with. If those foods weren't allowed to me, I think I would just be another colonized body, just walking around, not being connected to my cultura. And that to me is life, and which is why, again, I assert this over and over again. There is no food without culture, and there is no culture without food. And to me, food is everything. Yeah, thank you.
Our next question is on Zoom.
Yes. So our first question says, with sensitivity to reverse racism and white fragility, how can we talk more openly about decolonizing food? How do we have those difficult conversations in a way that allows for understanding, openness, and comfortable uncomfortability?
Yeah. White fragility. Oh, man. 30 seconds. Let me think. Honestly, I'm going to have to relate it to an experience. I was asked it was an animal rights, it was like radical animal rights event that I was invited to speak at. And I was the only person of color. And, and I had to literally like locate myself in that space. Like, I had to literally say, like, this is who I am. This is why I'm here. And I really had to talk about and address the white savior complex. I had to speak and let folks know that if they were there to, hear what I had to say, they were invited to stay. But if they were there to try to convince me otherwise, or try to tell me that my cultural heritage foods, were inferior foods, then they had to go. And it was something that I had to, it was a vulnerable moment, but I had to truly assert myself in that time, because I was like, my whole upbringing has been based off a Eurocentric perspective, and I wasn't there to necessarily continue to uphold that perspective. I was there to dismantle that perspective. And so like, I had to truly say it, like, at the very beginning. And it took a lot of courage because, I was, again, in a space of, complete whiteness, power, privilege. And, but I did it. And there was a lot of respect given. And it was great because then it allowed me to build solidarity with non-Indigenous and, white folks that were a little ruptured, were a little, and I invited them. I gave them words. I gave them, I told them, if you feel hurt, you could say, ouch, right? Or you can, and they did. We were talking and something kind of ruptured them a little bit and made them uncomfortable. And they would go, ouch. And I was like, but let's go on. And it was great. It turned out to be a really great experience. But it takes practice. It takes practice and courage. And you have to remember that when you're standing in a place that it's not just you by yourself, you're there with all your ancestors behind you, to the right of you and to the left of you. You are not there alone.
Hi. What I would like to share is more of a comment instead of a question, so it shouldn't take time from the Q&A. But I just wanted to say, so I'm Puerto Rican. For those of you who don't know, Puerto Rico is a modern and current colony of the United States. We are citizens, but we don't get to vote for the president. And I just wanted to talk about how your experiences with decolonization. So in Puerto Rico, there is a decolonizing movement. It's called Decolonizate, baby, which translates to decolonize yourself. It's mainly moved by the youth, but I had always thought about it as more of a mental, more of a racial, political issue. And I had never thought about it in like a food way or in method of what we take in and how Americanized our diet is as Puerto Ricans. And I just want to say thank you so much for opening my eyes to this new perspective, which I had never thought about before and which I will be implementing from now on.
I'm so excited for you. Thank you for sharing.
Hello. So I'm actually Chicana. I grew up in Texas, and both of my parents were from Mexico, and they were very poor, campesinos. And so my question to you is, how have you dealt with pushback within the community of saying that you're coming from a place of privilege? Because my parents grew up poor, meat was a luxury to them. So then once we're here and I reject that meat, it's a slight to them because they've worked so hard for it. So how have you dealt with that kind of mentality within the community?
You know what? I have. And, I was doing a presentation. I was at the YMCA, and it was mothers and, and I was just sharing some history. And what was really powerful is that I chose to sit down and I let them talk it out. And it was so great because the women were calling, they were, we say calling each other out, right? But they were really saying compañera, haz caso, listen to what, the compañera is saying. She's not saying don't consume this food. She's just providing, a historical context to make sense of why this food is part of our diet. And so then they asked me well, then what would I eat then? And so then we took that person's, that woman's, where she was from. We talked about the region and we said, well, what's native to your region? And then she talked about, she named food. She talked about venado, which is deer, venado. And she talked about, a particular type of fish. And I said, those are the foods that most likely, right? Your abuela ate, those are the foods that, when we're talking about decolonizing or re-indigenizing, that is something you would implement and bring back into your diet. And so I had to reassure her that I wasn't saying that not eating, certain foods was going to make her less inferior or was going to kind of speak bad to, their social location. But it was more of raising cultural awareness, cultural consciousness. And so when they understood it as that, then it became more accepted. But before it almost felt like an attack. Like, oh, you're attacking me. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I work so hard and, you know, like, you don't know what I ate. I had to eat quelites, and which are, you know, wild greens, and tortilla with salt. And that was it. And, you know, you're speaking to this. And I was like, no. Like, I'm not. What I'm saying is it's important for us to make these understandings and these connections. So then, you know, because you're asking the question, they were asking the question, why do we have a high rate of diabetes? Why do we have a high rate of obesity and cancer? And I was like, well, in order for us to understand why, we need to look at the history. And again, this is where Zapatismo theory comes in, because in order for us to make sense of the present, why do we have the issues we have? We can't just look back 50 years. Like, I'm a decolonial feminist. I'm like, we need to go way back, right, to make sense of today. And then so we can think about the future, because we have, you know, we're birthing babies, right? We're birthing the next generation. We can't set them up for failure. We need to set them up for success. And so yeah, it's, you know, and you learn from that, right? So I learned from that experience. So I've also, you know, enter spaces and like they say, you know who your audience is, right? Because then there's a different approach. There's a different way that you speak to elders. You know, one of my elders tells me all the time, don't you dare take away my fry bread. I'm like, I'm not here to take away your fry bread. I promise, right? But let's think about other toppings we can use. Let's think about other oils we can use, right? That's part of the decolonizing process, because, you know, fry bread's not really native, right? It was food that was used to sustain and survival food, like we call it. And so, you know, through my experiences, it's always really important to know who's in the audience, right? And how do we approach this? Because it is a sensitive issue. It really is, because food is also tied to class and you know, migrant immigrant experiences.
I think we have time for one more very quick question.
Okay.
If there's one more comment or question somebody would like to ask.
Henry.
There just were so many hands, and I love hearing all of these questions from
I know,
everyone.
they're
We could
so
go on
good.
for such a long time. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Well, my name is Metseri. We are like from the same village. My grandpa is Purepecha, from the Purepecha, from Michoacan. So, and I arrived to the U.S. like a year and a half. And since that moment, I was so kind of frustrated, because here the dynamic, and you are talking about that, just like with the thing about food, like time here is money. And when I was in Mexico, time was community. So I think to rethink the idea of food, it's a huge privilege in a society that always is giving you like the personal development push, like to pushing that you need to grow by yourself. And when you think, when I'm thinking dynamics where I can cook or where I can like share, I remember in my home like having a huge handmade pots full of mole or like or tinga or something, and here I have like a sartén, like a like a small pot with food, and I'm sometimes, because it takes a lot of time to cook here and people is like rushing all the time and you have to like, I have a lot of activities. I think I understand the context, but as you are like saying with the idea of food, is think about what we are dedicating more time and what is the real cost for that.
Yes.
Because food is a real cost of life. And
Absolutely.
It's a privilege to give that life to our bodies.
Yes.
So thank you for bringing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, immediately my mind goes to conviviality. You know, like I mentioned earlier, I have my students teach. I'm teaching a class on U.S. Latino identities, and you know, at the end of our lectures and at the end of our readings, we do an analysis and we look at what is this telling us, what is this showing us, and at the end, we always arrive to the same conclusion: is that you know, community matters. We cook because we thrive in community. We are community. And like in my family, when we all get in the kitchen, everybody's doing something. And it's, there's Merida Zabarca, she writes about this in Mexican American Women's Voices in the Kitchen. And she talks about charlas culinarias. She talks about, kitchen table methodology and ethnography, just to bring this into thinking about academia, right? But I'm like, this is living theory in the flesh. This is something we need. We need conviviality. Because again, right, when we're decolonizing, okay, that's great. That's one thing. But if we're going to re-indigenize, that means the family comes back. It means we're bringing family back. It means we're centering the table, right? Not the living room, not the bedroom, right? And again, this idea of individuality, that has a colonial legacy, right? Again, for me, you go back to the roots, to the beginning, thinking about the Spanish colonial encounter. They introduced this idea of civility, right? You don't eat communally, because that was an indigenous experience. And it still is when we have food sovereignty summits and gatherings, but it was discouraged because that meant you get to chismolear, right? It means you get to share, you get to talk, you get to uphold the teachings, you get to honor Tonantzin, you get to do the things that were considered, primitive, quote unquote, right? And so they discouraged that. That was discouraged, and it was intended to. You got to eat at a table. You got to have, your fork, your knife. Like, this is what civil people do, and you do it in your home. You don't do it in public. To do it in public is to not have class, is to not be civil, is to be uncivil, right? And I feel that throughout these years, folks have internalized that. And but I feel like that's why cultura is so powerful, because the culture does not allow it. The culture, just like corn, is saying, you know what, you can do whatever you want. You could try to dismantle me. I don't care. I'm not going to let that happen, because the culture, it reminds us we need to gather. We need family. We need to have these, these social moments. And that is what, cooking is about. It is about, that is my social time. And kid you not, today, 25-year-old Claudia used to love going out, doing all kinds of stuff. Nowadays, soon to be 48-year-old Claudia is like, who am I cooking with? You want to come over? You want to make, mole? You want to make, tortillas? And I'm out working, with all kinds of people almost every day now, doing something different around food. And it's really building community. And that's how we build community. And that's how we empower, because now folks are empowered to also do the same thing. They're like, oh, I also work with troubled youth, or, system impacted youth. And I had one young man say to me, you know what? He goes, they call me Miss. Miss, I can eat this every day, Miss. And I'm like, really? He's like, I want to make this, Miss. I'm like, you know what? Let's make it again tomorrow. He was like, really? Yes. And then guess what? All his other homies came, and they all were curious. They all wanted to try it. And I was like, this is how you build community. And these are youth that our government, our system is like, toss them and lock them up. But then you bring out food and you bring out a kitchen table and you're like, hey, let's cook. Guess what? They're there cooking. And so yeah, I think that's something we need to think more about too, in terms of building relations and recentering relationality as part of our decolonial and re-indigenizing processes.
Thank you so much. I really, I feel it was such a gift for me to be able to cook a little bit with you today, and I hope that we can find some way to make that happen more in the future. I just want to thank you so much for joining us, for coming out to New York, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience, your spirit with us. It was a real joy to talk with you. I also would really like to thank NYU Women Lead, the Global Leadership Accelerator, for making this happen, along with all of the faculty and staff of the Liberal Studies, the folks who are behind the Liberal Studies Global Lecture Series, my colleagues, and all the wonderful people I get to work with, especially Dean Julie Mostoff, Dee Simmons-Jandai, Gabriella Must, Vera Penovic, among many others who made this event happen. Thank you again to the kitchen for cooking this really terrific spread for us today to sample. Thank you for sharing your recipes with us. Everyone gets these beautiful recipe cards, and I hope that you will all make them, because they're amazing.
Share them with your families.
Thank you to the Women's Leadership Presidential Forum, the Office of Global Inclusion, and to all of the folks behind the scenes here, security, event staff here at Kimmel. This concludes our talk for the evening, but the space is open for a bit, so there is time for a little bit more mingling and building community amongst yourselves and together. So again, thank you, Dr. Serrato, for your time. What a pleasure.
I see my mother is walking out. Hold on. No, hold on. I also want to say my thank you because she's the one that birthed me. So I want to thank my mom for birthing me. She's the one that brought me into this world. And then I also want to thank my sister who's right here with the camera because she's the one that would try everything I would make. I would just make food and she would just try it and eat it. And of course, I just want to recognize my niece who's here, my Cielito, who is just a doll and is just enjoying our, cultural heritage foods and really appreciating it too. And then thank you all. And thank you all and your abuelas and your grandparents, because for some reason or another, they asked you to be here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be. So like we say at home, tlazokamati.
Thank you.